Welcome back. Leading off as always is my leadoff hitter. He's also my designated hitter. He's my cleanup. He's all of it. Starting pitcher, you name it. The great Luke Jones. Luke, welcome in.
Dennis, how are you? If I was a starting pitcher, I probably should have helped out the Orioles, based on what happened, especially in games 2 and 3. But how
Oh,
are you, my friend, as we reconvene? I think when you and I talked at this time a week ago, there was at least some hope that the Orioles would still be playing, even if it was coming down to a game 5 against the Rangers in the ALDS. But when you're talking about a 3-game sweep and 2 of those 3 games not being even all that competitive, a disappointing end to the season. There's no question about that.
so how was Texas? Other than that, did you enjoy the show, Mrs. Lincoln? Right? How was Texas? Hopefully, they were hospitable to you, and maybe you had some great food. But aside from the game,
I had some phenomenal brisket.
there
Thanks
you
for
go.
asking. So,
There you
so there
go.
was at least some good barbecue. I actually had the opportunity because Nestor and I know one of the PR staffers for the Dallas Cowboys. So we drove out to Frisco and actually saw the Star, the Ford Center, all that
Ah,
with
the
the
star.
Cowboys facility
Yeah.
in Frisco. And I'd heard great things about it. I mean, of course, your college football, high school football that's held there. It's more than just a training facility. It's an entire campus, and I was expecting a lot, but I would say it exceeded my expectations. It was
Really?
impressive. It really was. It was something, and I know they do tours, and we got the extra special tour, I guess, since we knew someone on the
Nice.
inside. But it was really an impressive facility, and I mean, not shocking, I guess, because we're talking about Jerry Jones here at the end of the day, and the investment and wanting to have the best. And obviously, I had a chance to, with Globe Life Field being right next to the Cowboys Stadium, I got to see that. I didn't go inside that, but saw that from the outside. But their headquarters really impressive. So that was cool. Got to see all the Vince Lombardi trophies. Got to see, Tom Landry's fedora. Got to see all kinds of stuff. I mean, really impressive. Even as someone who's never been a Dallas Cowboys fan, it was really cool to see all that.
So you got to see the rings, the fields, the locker room, first class. I mean, I went to Dallas Stadium back in 2011 for the Super Bowl between the Packers and the Steelers. Sat in the upper deck with the Yinzers waving my purple Ravens towel with my Ray Lewis number 52 jersey, and it was a lot of fun. But first class operation all the way.
It is. I mean, about the only thing that where it hasn't translated is to the field, right? I mean, they haven't been to an NFC championship game since
For a
what,
minute.
96, 95, 96, whenever it
Yeah.
was. So it's been a minute for them. There's no question about that. But yeah, impressive facility. And that's speaking as someone who has been out at the Ravens headquarters, which, the Ravens training facility has a reputation as one of the finest in the NFL. So it was cool to see that. It definitely was. I mean, it was a good trip, and I'd be remiss. I mean, I can remember over the years going on so many bus trips with WNST and Nestor putting together these trips and parties and all the different things that would go with that over the years, and would always say, we'll try to control everything and make everything the best it can be until the game, and then it's up to the team. And well, it didn't work out so well for the Orioles in that regard. I mean, a phenomenal season. It doesn't wipe that away, but tough not to be disappointed for them to go out in the fashion that they did.
And Luke, correct me if I'm wrong, but the Orioles organization has lost 8 straight games in the playoffs, right? That's quite a streak. And I'm a football guy first, and when I think about football playoff losses, you think about the Cundiff miss, but at home you think about the 2006 loss to the Colts with Peyton Manning. It was 5 field goals to two. So these losses, I mean, again, they're by different teams, different eras, but they still, as a fan of the organization of the club, they do pile up on you, don't they?
No question about it. I mean, you mentioned 2006. I mean, 2019. I saw at least a few people draw some comparisons between this year's Orioles and those 2019 Ravens, who were 14-2. What, 13 guys went to the
Yeah,
Pro Bowl. Of course,
yeah.
Lamar Jackson was unanimous MVP, and
Right.
they lost to the Titans, who, we'll talk about them in a few moments. But yeah,
And had some time
and
off,
it's something.
had a bye, had some time off. We talked about rust versus the guys
Yeah.
playing. So all these things come into play.
No question about it. And hey, I mean, the LA Dodgers got swept, and they're another 100-loss team or 100-win team that got swept. So I
with a
think
much
there's
larger payroll than the Orioles too. Let's throw that
no
in
doubt.
there.
No doubt, a much larger payroll, although certainly their starting pitching was ravaged by injuries this year. But yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely something to that. And let's be clear, I'm not at all suggesting that that's the reason why the Orioles lost to the Rangers. I mean, the Texas Rangers are playing really good baseball. That Rangers-Astros series is going to be fun. It really is. I think with how both those clubs are playing right now. But there is something to and we talked about this last week. I mean, it's just very unbaseball like. You get a bye in the NFL. I mean, that's baked into the schedule, right? You get a bye every regular season. So you at least have some experience dealing with that. And it's a once a week proposition anyway when you play. But baseball, you play every night, right? I mean, even the All-Star break is 4 days, so this was longer than the All-Star break. So I think it was one of many factors. I don't think it was the deciding factor by any stretch of the imagination. I think it just comes down to the Orioles didn't play well. I mean, they didn't hit in game one. They didn't pitch in game two. In game three, they didn't either. So, I mean, that's going to add up to being swept by when you're going up against a good club. So, but I think it is something that when you look at how the last 2 years have played out since they've introduced this system where the top two seeds in each league get buys. Last year, you saw Atlanta and the Dodgers be bounced, and they were the two best teams in the National League. This year, you saw the Orioles, best team in the American League record-wise, bounced, and the Dodgers, second best team in the National League, bounced. And as you and I are talking right now, and if someone's listening to this later on, our apologies, but you have the Atlanta Braves who are down 2-1 and facing elimination as the best team in baseball in the division round. So I don't know. I mean, that's still a relatively small sample size, but it's tough not to look at that and say there's probably something to it. Now, is Major League Baseball going to do anything about that? Is there a way you can tweak that system? I don't know, but it's definitely interesting. But for the Orioles, I mean, it just comes down to it. Yeah, they played some of their worst baseball of the year over these 3 games, especially games 2 and 3. I mean, you have your starting pitcher not get out of the second inning in consecutive games.
Yeah.
Dennis, spells disaster in May, let alone October. And I saw some people who didn't like some pitching decisions here or there, and I'll be in agreement on, like, for example, Brian Baker even being on the postseason roster. But at the same time, when you have two guys in Grayson Rodriguez and Dean Kramer who you depended on as much as you did all season, and look, Grayson Rodriguez was one of the better pitchers in the American League in the second half of the season. Dean Kramer still had a good season overall. When they just completely flop in that way, it's going to be really difficult to overcome that, especially if you don't swing the bats. And the Orioles swung the bats fairly well in game 2, but that was it. They didn't hit other than that. So, they didn't play well enough. I mean, it's that simple. We try to, we can talk about buy and rest versus rust and all those different elements that we talk about talk about that in the NFL. We talked about that with the 19 Ravens, but at the end of the day, sometimes it's just as simple as one team outplayed the other, and the Texas Rangers absolutely outplayed the Orioles. That doesn't ruin what was a really memorable season, and there's still so many different things to be excited about moving forward. But yeah, it's definitely a sour note, a really tough way to end your season when there was just so much excitement. And as we said about those 19 Ravens, and I'll say the same thing about these Orioles now, as we'll look to the off season and spring training and see what moves they potentially make. Hopefully, add another starting pitcher. See what else they can do. But you're never guaranteed to get back to that same spot. I'll say this much: I am quite confident we're going to see this young core, this current edition of the Baltimore Orioles, making future Octobers. Over the next 3, 4, 5 years. I'd be shocked if they're not back multiple times. You're not going to say every single year because you never know.
Right.
But I have that expectation. However, I'm not so sure they're going to win 101 games again. I'm not so sure they're going to be the number 1 seed again. Which, hey, you see how this postseason is playing out. Maybe that's not of the utmost importance. Maybe you don't need to win 100+ games to win the World Series. So Point is, there are no guarantees. I do think they're going to be back, but you want to seize the moment because the Ravens are such a great example of this. In 2019, Ravens fans tried to say what to reassure themselves? Well, they were ahead of schedule, right? They're going to be back. And we see how that's played out since then. And some of that out of their control, mind you, when you talk about, I think, just the strangeness of the pandemic in general and how that impacted different teams. But, injuries and we'll get to this in a moment, but, we also have a Ravens team that has some unsettling aspects to their DNA that we're seeing and that played out again against Pittsburgh this past Sunday, where they struggle to finish. And I kind of question this team's killer instinct at times. So, point is, when you're in a position like the Ravens were in 19 or like the Orioles were this year, when you are the number one seed and you have home field advantage, if you don't take advantage of that, there's an element of that you really squandered an opportunity because you just don't know if you're going to be back in that same exact position in the future. And you just want to take advantage because you never really know what's truly going to happen.
Yeah, no question about it, Luke. And we talked about the Batista injury and
Yeah.
how difficult that was to overcome down the stretch, the timing of it. John Means being a scratch.
Yeah.
There's a guy that, woulda, coulda, woulda, maybe, who knows, maybe not, but still would have had a better chance with him pitching game 3 than Dean Kramer. And of course, Kramer, I don't know where his head was at, and
Yeah.
with what's going on overseas, which is much more important than
Sure.
a baseball game, but still wondering what his headspace was heading into that game. But would have much rather had John Means in there for a number of reasons.
Yeah, I don't think there's any question about that. I mean, for Batista, I mean, it's tough to argue that Felix Batista's presence at the back end of the bullpen would have made that much of a difference because the Orioles never even got, they never got to a save
That's
situation.
a great point. Never got
So,
that far, unless he starts the game for you, right? At least
right,
keep him up
right,
the
exactly.
score for 2 or 3 innings.
Yeah, use them as a 2 inning opener, like the Rays use with their relievers sometimes. But no, but it clearly we talked about from the moment he walked off the mound in late August, that absolutely decreased the probability of
Sure.
them winning the World Series, regardless of how this Rangers series played out. Let's say even if they had moved on and gotten to the ALCS or gotten to the World Series, at some point in time, Batista's absence was going to show up.
Sure.
I don't think anyone's talking out of turn suggesting that. But you're right. I mean, the John Means injury, I think the way this team was set up, and we talked about this all year, despite the fact that they won 101 games, and that was their best regular season since 1979. If you looked at this team from a run differential standpoint, in the same way we talk about point differential, that's why
Sure.
everyone talked about the 2019 Ravens, who had the best point differential in the NFL since what, the '07 Patriots. They had been that dominant. They didn't just win, they blew teams out. That wasn't really how the Orioles operated this year. It was much more of a win close games, win close games. That's fine. That's not a knock on them. However, what that does mean is you have a smaller margin for error. So you lose Felix Batista, which credit to the Orioles for keeping it together as well as they did after the Batista injury. Because you look at their record, they still had a winning record. They still played well. They still won the division. But everything is more tenuous then. Everything is more delicate in terms of how it's going to fit. So you had that in the bullpen. The saving grace for this team in the second half of the season was how well their rotation pitched. Even putting aside the failure and disappointment of the Jack Flaherty trade, they pitched so well, with their rotation. So, Bradish, you know, they took Hyde took him out when he did, and some people would have liked to see Brendan Hyde leave him in a little bit longer. I'll hear that, but Bradish pitched well enough. It's not as though he was bad in game 1, but Grayson Rodriguez, who was phenomenal in the second half of the season. Look, let's be clear. He earned an opportunity to pitch and start in the ALDS. But to your point, you were really hoping that John Means was going to present a really enticing number 3 starter for you. And that's not a knock on Dean Kramer. That's not a knock on Kyle Gibson. But we've seen John Means. I mean, John Means was an all-star 4 years ago. He pitched a no-hitter 2 years ago. First no-hitter, solo no-hitter for the Orioles since Jim Palmer in 1969. So we know what John Means is capable of. And even coming off Tommy John surgery, he was looking more and more like John Means with just about every start. So there was some excitement there. And that's not, let's be clear. I had no expectation that John Means was going to go out and throw 7 innings for you in a playoff game, but I had expectations that he would fare better than Dean Kramer or Kyle Gibson and give you a real chance. And unfortunately for Kramer, and I'm with you, and I even touched on this in my 12 Orioles thoughts, I want to be sensitive to what's happening in Israel and the fact that Dean Kramer has family impacted by this. And from what I understand, even has family living there, which, as of a couple of days ago when he was asked in the press conference, it sounds like his family's okay. But we know, without getting into any specifics or anything like that, we know how volatile and how sad and how troubling that entire situation is. So with that in mind, that's not to say that, that I think that Brandon Hyde absolutely made the wrong decision, but I do see maybe there being an argument to saying you go with Kyle Gibson there just because Dean Kramer was dealing with such a heavy
Sure.
heart and a heavy mind and just the emotions of that. Was that the reason why he got shelled? I don't know. It's impossible to say that, Dennis. I mean, all of these different factors that we talk about are really difficult to quantify. Just like in a general sense, was this stage too big for the Orioles? It's kind of tough to say it wasn't because of how they played. They just didn't play well, and having a chance to be in that post game clubhouse in Game 3. I asked a couple players, with the whole premise of October's different, right? The postseason's different. Everyone says that. So having gone through it, what stood out to you? What did you learn? And a few players absolutely acknowledged the crowd noise being so much different. And I remember chatting with Austin Hayes or Kyle Gibson, someone a day or two before the series started, and someone had asked them about playing in front of a packed house at Camden Yards and what they'd heard about what a postseason atmosphere it could be and all that. And I remember I said to them once the scrum, the concluded, I said, "Be ready. It's like a football crowd." And they kind of just, they nodded because they hadn't experienced that. But a couple guys acknowledged that it might have unnerved them a little bit, which I think is a very honest thing to admit when you consider what a typical baseball crowd is like, and then what you have in October. Now, I don't think that's a long-term indictment for these young players. I think now they know what to expect. So you got to play well. You got to get back to that stage, but I think they'll be much more mentally prepared to handle that than when the next opportunity comes. But it's different. And to get back to your original question and point about John Means, we knew that the Orioles had a very specific way of how they tried to win baseball games this year, and it worked so well. But then when you remove a Felix Bautista in late August, even though it didn't show up in this series just because they didn't have a save situation, so it's not like they blew a save opportunity. But you have that, and then you had a rotation that you were hoping John Means was going to give you a little more upside, and for him to have the sore elbow, which from what I understand, it doesn't sound like it's something that they're overly concerned about, like in terms that he had like this new bad injury or anything, but just had some soreness, which is probably pretty typical when you kind of like guys coming back from a 17-month absence after Tommy John surgery, where you're rehabbing and working your way up, and then you get to a point where you're doing a throwing progression, and then you're pitching in minor league games. You get back to a major league setting where you're talking about the most competitive environment on earth as far as that how it pertains to your livelihood. Yeah, there's going to be a greater stress there. So it's not uncommon for someone to deal with a little bit of soreness. And the expectation that Brandon Hyde expressed anyway, and I was skeptical of that, but we'll never know, at least not at this point unless they admit it. But there was a thought that he might be available for the ALCS, but when you missed him,
Mhm.
didn't have him, and then Grayson Rodriguez just completely fell on his face, and you feel for the guy. I mean, he's 23, he'll be back. I think he'll be better for it in the long run. I still am a big believer in what kind of pitcher he can be, but when you have that happen, and then Dean Kramer in place of John Means, you know, needless to say, I mean, look at the numbers. It didn't work out well. As I said, if that happens to you in May, back-to-back games, boy, you're feeling it for a few days because your bullpen is going to be a mess. But unfortunately, when it's October, it's usually going to signal, well, you're probably going home because you're going to get your butts kicked. And that's what happened to the Orioles in games 2 and 3.
For sure, but they knew that this was going to be a new thing for the young players, a new experience for them. I know that in football they pipe in crowd noise sometimes in practice.
Yeah.
Do you know if they ever did that with at the stadium? Did they? I mean, I guess in terms of preparation, how well were the young guys prepared to? And not that you can fully simulate the towel waving,
Yeah.
etc. Things may be thrown at you or swear words, but in terms of that crowd noise and preparing this team, I don't know if that was done. I'm just asking the question.
Yeah. No, that's a great question. I've thought of that as well. I can say this. I can't say that I know whether they did that at all. I was at the workout on last Tuesday, last Wednesday, and last Friday. Now, Friday is the official Major League Baseball pre-series workout, so I'm guessing they wouldn't have been able to do anything like that.
Okay.
But those other workouts that I mentioned were just Orioles, like it was just the Orioles working out in their home ballpark. They did not do anything like that while the media was there. So I think that's something that's going to be interesting, I think, to see, whether that's something that's added to spring training,
Yeah.
whether that's something that they do differently next year if they're preparing for October baseball and they're, fortunate enough and they play well enough to qualify for the postseason again.
In
But I
fairness to
think
them, they haven't had to prepare for this in many years.
of
maybe
course,
maybe
right.
it was an oversight on their part, right? They haven't.
Yeah.
This is not the norm for them, right? So
Yeah, and it's a different, it's a different animal because I mean NFL teams do it because it's not as though they're so worried about guys actually playing like in the midst of a play that they're worried about the crowd
right.
noise. It's about what? Their communication, right? Getting the signals in, you making sure that you're either your inside linebacker or whoever has the green dot, and obviously your quarterback can hear. But no, I think it's fair. And I will say this, I do recall this, and this was a number of years ago. I do know under Buck Showalter years ago in spring training at the least. Now I can't speak to any remembering any of that with workouts, for the times that they made the playoffs. But I do remember there were some spring trainings where they would pipe in crowd noise
Yeah.
for pop-ups and things of that nature, where anything where you had to communicate. So, I think it's, again, do I think the crowd noise was the deciding factor? No,
No.
it's still at some point in time you have to perform, right? And the Rangers just performed way better than they did. I mean, you just have to tip your cap and you have to acknowledge that the Orioles didn't play well. I'm not trying to beat them up on that. It's just the reality. Look at the scores. Look at how it played out. But I do think that's definitely something that if I were a manager, if I were a general manager, if I were a coach, that I would consider. I don't think you necessarily need to conduct all of your workouts doing that, but maybe that's something that you do a little bit of. So I'll try to find out if that was something that they did at
Just out of
any point.
curiosity.
But and like I said, Dennis, before you even brought it up, I mean, it's something that I randomly thought of. I might have been Monday, between the off day between game 2 and game 3. I even thought, with some of these guys talking about crowd noise, you do wonder if that's something that they were exposed to from a standpoint of trying to prep for it, or they just weren't. But knowing how much NFL teams practice with crowd noise when they know they're playing on the road, it's definitely there's definitely some merit to at least exposing your guys to that a little bit more. But again, was that the deciding factor in the series? No, but it's just one of the many variables that we've kind of talked about as far as what went wrong. And hey, when you get swept and when you lose a couple of the games fairly certainly game 3 was in decisive fashion. Game 2, the Orioles made it somewhat close late. But there are a lot of things you could point to, a lot of blame to go around. They weren't good enough. But I think the crowd noise factor is definitely interesting.
All right. So as a football fan, I'm already looking at the Ravens offseason, looking at the NFL draft, left tackle, cornerback. So what do you see? And now, I don't know if you had time to fully digest the Orioles season, but what do you see the Orioles offseason? What do you think it's going to look like if you had and I don't know if you've looked at it that far yet. and I wouldn't blame you if you haven't,
Yeah.
but I'm just
I,
just spitballing here, just thinking, okay, this is what happened. We know what the deficiencies are. How do they address? How do they move forward? How do they get better? And they could be a better team and still not win 101 games. We understand that, right?
oh,
But
absolutely.
every season, we also understand that every season stands on its own. Just because the Ravens were a juggernaut in 2019 didn't mean they're going to be a juggernaut in 2020. Same thing with the Orioles. So, what does this team have to do to get better next year in order for them to progress, make the playoffs, and also progress into the playoffs?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I full disclosure, I haven't looked at the
Okay,
pending free agent list in terms of who else might be about out there, but in a general sense, one, here's the first disclaimer, and it's a big one. Where are they with ownership in terms of John Angelos and his willingness to increase payroll? Obviously the lease is not official and is not done until it's done, right? I mean, despite phony announcements being made to steal the thunder of the team on the night that they clinched the AL East, which really is a sour, bad look. The way that was done. I mean, grandstanding. Quite frankly, not a great look for John Angelos, and frankly, not a great look for the governor either, as they both appeared on the video board that night that they clinched the AL East. That aside, understanding that, fully acknowledging that being a major disclaimer here.
mm-hmm.
I think you look at this roster right now, the obvious thing that sticks out is you need more starting pitching. Now, I will say this, and I've seen a lot of fans say, well, you need a frontline starting pitcher. I don't even know if you necessarily need a number one. And let's be clear, it's not always easy to get a true number one starter because they're not always available because teams try to keep them.
Sure.
And even if you say you want to get one, are the Orioles going to go from being a bottom payroll to suddenly giving a pitcher $30 million a year? I doubt you're going to see that. So what I would like to see, if I'm trying to balance what they need with what's realistic, acknowledging ownership, acknowledging payroll, acknowledging that Mike Elias has worked fairly conservatively as general manager to this point, has been very methodical in how they built their roster through the draft and through player development and what have you. What I would like to see, if you look back to the last two off seasons, who did the Orioles sign as a starting pitcher last winter? Kyle Gibson. Year
Mm-hmm.
before that, it was Jordan Lyles. Now, Kyle Gibson was a modest upgrade over Jordan Lyles. Modest, albeit, yes, an upgrade. What I would like to see them aim for, and again, I don't have that list in front of me of who's truly going to get to the market and be a free agent, or I think the other scenario here that might be more interesting for the Orioles is a pitcher that becomes available that maybe is under contract or under club control, and maybe you trade a couple of your prospects. What I would like to see is sign a starting pitcher or trade for a starting pitcher that to me fits no worse than their number 3 starter. And that would be if you're saying, you know what? Kyle Bradish was one of the absolute best pitchers in the American League this year.
Sure.
Kyle Bradish is, when the Cy Young Award comes out, and I fully expect Garrett Cole of the Yankees to win it, but Kyle Bradish is going to be on that list of guys that get votes. I mean, that's how well he pitched this year. So you have him. You still have Grayson Rodriguez with his upside. So I'm even okay. I can live with the idea of saying, you know what? As an organization, we really believe in those two being our top 2 starters. So if you're going to say that, that's fine. Then I want someone that you feel can be better or at least as good as John Means has been at his absolute best. I want the Orioles to acquire a starting pitcher that you say right now, no questions asked, assuming everyone's healthy, is a guy that we say, no doubt about it, he will be one of our top 3 starters in the American League Division Series, the ALCS, or the World Series. So that for me, that's a big one right there. So that would be my top priority as far as what I'm trying to acquire this offseason. So beyond that, I think it gets more interesting, Dennis, because while I look at this offense, and for me, you had a group that on any given night, Brandon Hyde could pencil in 8 or 9 guys who had an OPS. And when I say OPS, Dennis, that is on base percentage, which is your ability to get on base, and slugging percentage, which is your ability to hit for power. They had a lineup of 8 or 9 guys on any given night that had an OPS of at least 700, which is, a lot of teams can't say that. That's good. That's solid. That's really solid. However, they didn't have anyone, at least just yet, who profiled as being, quote, the man, like that guy that's an absolute stud at the plate. Now, I'll say this. I fully expect Gunnar Henderson's going to become that guy. He wasn't quite that yet, but he's rookie. He's going to be rookie of the year, and he is trending towards being that guy. Adley Rutschman's a really good hitter in terms of his on-base percentage, ability to draw walks. Didn't hit for quite as much power this year as I thought he would, but again, you're talking about a guy that to me is still going to get better. Jackson Holliday, the top prospect in all of baseball. Dennis, I'm guessing he's going to be on their opening day roster. The question for me is he going to be the shortstop and Gunner's going to play third base, or does Gunner play shortstop and maybe Jackson Holliday plays second base for them? So you're adding him to the mix. You still have in the minor leagues, and even though he was on the roster, he wasn't a starting player yet. Heston Kjerstad for the outfield or DH. You have Colton Cowser for the outfield. So to sit here and say that with any kind of a definitive conviction that they need to add another bat. Look, based on how this lineup was constructed this year, could they have benefited from another top tier, top shelf kind of bat? Yeah, they could have. Do I think they're going to go out and sign or trade for that? It's tougher for me to say that because they still have so many position players at AAA right now, Dennis, who feel like they're ready to be part of this. So how's that going to work out in terms of who's still in the system, who might be involved in a potential trade to go get a starting pitcher? So there are a lot of moving parts in that way. But, again, for me, there are different things you can do. You can always get better. I don't want to hear anyone say, well, the Orioles are fine, right? And what I mean by that is, yeah, you could basically stand pat and probably still have a great chance to make the playoffs just because of the young core that they have. But don't be complacent, right? You want to get better. You want to figure out how you can get better. So for me, it does begin with adding, doesn't have to be an ace, but at least the top half of your starting rotation kind of pitcher, at least a guy that you say, man, this guy's at least the number 3 starter. He could be the number 2 starter. If we're going to say that Bradish and Grayson are our top 2, I'm okay with that. Because again, they were among the very best in the AL, especially in the second half of the season. But that for me is number 1. I do think you look at the bullpen, understanding that Felix Bautista is not going to play next year. I mean, he's out. He had Tommy John surgery a few days ago, so he's not going to pitch. So I think you like Yennier Cano. I think DL. I'd be very tempted, and this is tough because the Orioles have wanted to make him a starting pitcher, but one of the bright spots of the ALDS to me, Dennis, was I thought DL Hall pitched really well out of the bullpen.
He did.
So I don't know if they're going to give up on him becoming a starter. They'll probably send him to spring training and want him to get stretched out, but I don't know. At this point in his development, I kind of wonder if maybe you just say, you know what? I think TL Hall, either he could be their closer this coming season because you're not going to have Bautista, or he could be a really, really good high leverage 8th inning kind of reliever for you. So you have those two, and then Tyler Wells is kind of in the same boat as DL Hall. He had a lot of success in the first half of the season as a starting pitcher, but he ran out of gas. Is that a sign maybe he's best suited as a bullpen arm? And if you have those 3 in the back end of your bullpen, and maybe, you go out and sign another veteran or something like that, you might have the makings of a pretty darn good bullpen there. But without knowing what they envision for DL Hall and Tyler Wells and whether they're going to try to stretch them out as starters, it does complicate things a little bit more. So, but that's what I really point to. I mean, for me, starting pitcher, I mean, that's number 1 by a wide margin for me. 2, I think you do want to look to fortify your bullpen, knowing that you're not going to have your stud in the 9th inning, because Felix Bautista is going to be out for 2024. I mean, if by some miraculous chance he's back for the end of 24, then great, but you certainly can't plan for that. Tommy John is typically a 12 to 16 month kind of return timetable. So you're still looking for him spring training of 2025. So starting rotation, at another starting pitcher. And I wouldn't even be opposed to like I mentioned, a guy that is at least a number 3 starter. And I wouldn't even be opposed to, throwing another starting pitcher into the mix that would compete for the back end, because that could then impact keeping DL Hall in the bullpen, keeping Tyler Wells in the bullpen, and fortifying your bullpen on that front. So you have that. And then, after that, I think it's just, it becomes interesting because of where you are with your position players, especially the outfield, where, you have Heston Kjerstad, who, has kind of done everything he can do at AAA. I mean, he was on the postseason roster. We didn't see him a whole lot, obviously, but do you want to kind of move toward him becoming a starting player for you? Where are they with Colton Cowser? I mean, you still have Anthony Santander, Austin Hayes, Cedric Mullins, but all three of those guys, you're talking about arbitration, players that are already into arbitration, and they're going to become more expensive. And that doesn't mean that I'm worried about the Orioles saving money, but how they're going to operate, how they're going to look at those guys as they're getting a little bit older, and you have these young guys to potentially replace them. How does that all fit? Do they trade one of those veteran outfielders that I just mentioned in a deal to go get a starting pitcher? I don't know. I mean, there are a lot of different ways they can go about doing this, but I think the very common theme that you can hear me echoing here, Dennis, is pitching, right? Adding more to their pitching staff, adding another really legitimate starting pitcher to their rotation, maybe adding another veteran to the back end of their bullpen to kind of go with these young guys that that they're going to have to piece this together a little bit with with Felix Bautista being out for 24. So, they have work to do. However, everything that I just laid out, all that being said, got a heck of a young core, and they've got more guys coming. So it's not as though they need to do anything drastic. I think this is much more in the category of augmenting what is already a really good baseball team. And that's what's exciting. I mean, that's where the Ravens, post 2019, that's where they were, right? I mean, go add. Now, you could say at the time they should have added another wide receiver, for example, that offseason, but we've gone over that, and we'll get to the Ravens here, I'm sure, in a few moments. But there's work to be done. There's work to do to strengthen your chances of not just getting back, but to your point, putting yourself in a better position to advance in October. And I think you have to you go back to the starting pitching, and yeah, Bradish will be another year older, so that should be a good thing for him. Grayson Rodriguez will be another year older. That should be a great thing for him. John Means with a full off season where he doesn't, he's not going to be rehabbing per se. He can come to spring training and be ready to go like any normal starting pitcher. So you've got the makings right there of a promising rotation. I'm guessing Gibson's not going to be back. You're still going to have Dean Kramer in the mix, who, okay, it didn't work out for him as your number 3 starter in the division series, but he's still, he had a really good season. So, if he's my number 4 or number 5 starter, I still feel good about that. But, the pitching is definitely where I would be focused. But at the same time, you never want to pigeonhole yourself, right? If you have an opportunity that you can go out and acquire a bat at, at a position that we're not necessarily talking about right now, but it makes you better, then I am not going to sit here and say, absolutely don't do that, right? I mean, there are, you can look at your roster and say you're covered at all these different positions, but if you have a chance to make an upgrade, to make an improvement somewhere, you should certainly do that. But yeah, it's very simple to look at this and say, really comes down to pitching. But their offense didn't show up in 2 of the 3 games either, and their offense kind of struggled in September. So, how much of that was fatigue? How much of that is, maybe you do want to at least explore the possibility and see what could be out there, even making an upgrade on that side of the ball.
He is Luke Jones breaking down the Baltimore Orioles and a very early look at the potential offseason needs and perhaps some moves. And with that, we'll segue over to the Baltimore Ravens, who just are coming off of a disappointing loss to the hated Pittsburgh Steelers. Lots to unpack from that game. The game was lost on many, many levels. Not just the 5, 6, 7 drops, however you want to quantify them, but whether it was clock management, coaching, not being able to block, calling a cover 0 and failing to double cover the best wide receiver on the field. To me, Luke, it was a multitude of mistakes not placed on one person's shoulders.
No question about it, Dennis. And as I mentioned at BaltimorePositive.com in the aftermath of the Orioles losing game 2 and the Ravens having lost that game earlier in the day in Pittsburgh. The Orioles, I think it was a lot of disappointment this week. I felt a lot of disgust with that Ravens loss because Dennis, and I'm glad you mentioned, I mean, look, everyone fixates and focuses on the drops, and I wholeheartedly agree. If the Ravens don't have all those drops, they're never in the position that they're in the fourth quarter. That said, that said, a big part of football or any sport, quite frankly, is how do you handle the sequence of events? How do you handle what happens over the course of the game to the point where you're in the fourth quarter and whatever the score is, whatever the circumstances or explanation was that lead you to that point, how do you respond to that? And Dennis, this is where I look at the Baltimore Ravens right now, and this has been a couple years now. I have a lot of concerns about the DNA of this football team at this point because I was looking at this the other day, and I'm not talking about being behind by one score, but going back, and I could be wrong about this because I was going on about 3 hours of sleep when I looked this up, but I am pretty certain that the last time the Ravens had a comeback victory in which they trailed multiple scores, I want to say it was that Vikings game 2 years ago, where they won in overtime. Now, part of this is, to their credit, the Ravens don't find themselves down multiple scores very often. So I'm not even concerned that they don't have wins where they've trailed by multiple scores and they've come back and won since then, because that scenario hasn't happened very often. However, since that point in time, and we're coming up on nearly 2 years ago that occurred, you look at what happened at the end of 2021, and Lamar wasn't out there. I get that. You know, a lot of weird things. They had games where they tried to go for two and make fourth down decisions, things of that nature. But I can't help but feel with that was something that started to become part of their DNA moving forward. And since then, you have the Miami game last year. You have the Buffalo game last year. You have the Giants game last year. The Jacksonville game last year. By the way, all those games I just mentioned, games Lamar Jackson played in. You have the Pittsburgh game in week 17 last year, which was Tyler Huntley, fully acknowledging that, but the defense faltered at the end of the game, despite the fact that they had played well. Indy a few weeks ago, and now Pittsburgh. Dennis, I just fired off, 7 different games over the last season, and now, 5 games into this season, so we're talking close to a season and a half. 7 different games where they have lost, despite the fact that they had a 2-score lead in all of those games at some point in time. And some of those games fairly late in the football game. That's not good. That to me is an indictment on just about every part of their operation. And look, that's not me sitting here saying that they should go 17-0. We know that you're going to lose some games. And I'll even say, of those 7 games, I'm not saying that you have to win all 7 of those every single time. However, what I just laid out, Dennis, is the difference between just being a playoff team and being a wild card as the Ravens were last year, for example. And again, I know Lamar Jackson has been injured the last couple of years. I get that. Everyone understands that. Everyone knows that. But when you drop games, that many games where it should be in hand, and you're continually letting the other team get off the mat and come back on you, and whether your offense plays great for a certain amount of time and then bogs down, whether your defense is great for 3.5 quarters, as the Ravens were on Sunday in Pittsburgh, but then has a breakdown at the very end of the game and gives up a 41-yard touchdown with a little over a minute to go, whether your quarterback, who was outstanding against the Steelers and should have had these great numbers because his receivers let him down, but he also threw a terrible interception at a crucial point in the game. Whether you have a coaching staff, and look, John Harbaugh is going to be a Hall of Fame coach the way it trends, because if Bill Cowher is, why isn't John Harbaugh? So he's going to be in Canton someday, and if he wins another Super Bowl at some point, it's not even a question, right?
Lock, yeah.
But you have what happened at the end of the first half, and yeah, Tyler Linderbaum may have messed up there, and he owned that, and look, that's a credit to him, but why are you even bothering doing that? That's getting too cute. Even if you got a first down there, are you really like that thinking, or not a first down, even if you get them to jump there, is it still that high percentage that you're going to score a touchdown there when you acknowledge there's a downside to trying that, and the downside is what happened there, and you got nothing then. When you fail to call a timeout at the end, with what happened with Zay Flowers and the kickoff against the Indianapolis a couple weeks ago, these are breakdowns across the board. Special teams, they got a punt blocked in the fourth quarter on Sunday. So that's on John Harbaugh. That's on all 53 guys on the roster. That's on every coach. That's not good. We're seeing a team that over the last 2 years, Dennis, is good. I'm not saying they're a bad football team. Of course they're not a bad football team because they're still winning more than they lose, but these kind of breakdowns are not indicative of a team that really knows how to win and a team that knows how to maximize its potential. And that's concerning to me. And that's the difference between a wild card or winning the division potentially. And look, they're still in good position, and maybe Cincinnati showed that they're ready to get off the mat because they looked more like the Bengals last week. But even saying if they can still win the division, this is the difference between having to play maybe your first round game at home, but then you're on the road the rest of the way, and having a chance to be the number one seed or to play more home games in January. That matters. And to see these kind of breakdowns, I see a team that really is struggling to deal with adversity in the midst of the game. Now, they do a great job from Monday through Saturday, and they have in dealing with injuries, because you look at, the Cincinnati win in week 2. The defense has risen to the occasion before, with Marlon Humphrey just returning, Marcus Williams missing most of the season, with the pass rush and no Bowser, no Owe. So it's not as though they don't handle adversity at all, but in-game adversity, when things start to go sideways in the midst of a game, they're not handling that well. And they haven't handled that well for a couple years now. And for me, Dennis, boy, that's an indictment on your DNA as a football team. And that right there does not reflect well for your ability to not necessarily make the playoffs, because, they made the playoffs last year even without Lamar Jackson. Yeah. But if we're talking about actually wanting to do something, if we're talking about making a deep run, if we're talking about going to a Super Bowl, and you can't handle these things and you can't finish off opponents, even inferior opponents. I mean, Dennis, maybe Mike Tomlin will have the Steelers playing better later in the year because he typically does, but I was not impressed by that football team. And okay, their defense rose to the occasion late. I'll give them that. But I was very underwhelmed by what I saw from the Steelers on Sunday. Indianapolis, look, they have some strengths to that football team, and maybe they're a little bit better than your typical team that's picking in the top 5 like they were in April, but that's still not a very good football team. And you lost to them at home in a game that you should have won. So these are not what we're laying out here is not flattering from a coaching standpoint or from just a team's DNA. Looking at them and saying, a lot of what I'm laying out there, Dennis, is I'm kind of questioning their mental toughness, not their toughness in terms of tackling and all that, but kind of questioning their mental toughness, because I just reeled off 6, 7, 8 games over the last 2 seasons where they've kind of crumbled in crunch time, where things start to go south a little bit and they just haven't recovered. So I don't know about you, Dennis, and let's be clear, this doesn't mean I think they're falling apart and that they're going to go 6-11 or anything like that, but we're beyond just this team just making the playoffs, right? I mean, at some point in time, it's like you can't keep talking about wanting to win a Super Bowl. But then when you're seeing these things, it really makes me doubt your ability to put together a 3 or 4 game run in January to win a Super Bowl. So really disappointing to see how that played out on Sunday. You could tell even several days later that that feeling of disgust, I think a lot of Ravens fans had, even as they were going into watching game 2 and then seeing the Orioles lay an egg that night.
Yeah, I think you put it very well, all the points that you made, Luke, but the lead up to the fact that the Colts, the Steelers, these are the type of games that impact you later on in the season. In terms of making the playoffs, your playoff seedings, having to go to Buffalo versus having a home game in Baltimore, having to go to Kansas City versus having a home game in Baltimore. These are the things that you see that make you say, and question, to your point there, DNA. I was very happy to see Patrick Queen say, I'm just
Yeah.
tired of this, right? I'm sick and tired of this. And Patrick Queen to me has really done a lot of things right. He kept his mouth shut. He came in, he's playing at a very high level. He's evolving to a leader. And if I'm Eric DaCosta, I'm looking to see if there's any way I can keep this young man on the
Yeah.
roster with Roquan Smith. I look at the 49ers. They have two great middle linebackers. And speaking of the Niners, that's a good team. That's a team I saw
Yeah.
play on Sunday night and just absolutely smacked another very good team in the Dallas Cowboys right in the mouth. Did everything well, managed the clock, managed the game, managed the X's and O's, which is something that we haven't seen the Ravens do consistently. And some of these guys need to grow up. I mean, Marlon Humphrey, I love Marlon Humphrey, but if he wants to be a broadcaster, you know what? Go practice because you're not really good at it right now, young man. Be the best football player you can be, and then you focus on your post-football career when you get there, not before you get there. So, whether it's him or Odell Beckham Jr., whoever, they need some focus, guys. And you can see Roquan Smith is also getting pissed off because,
Yeah.
the defense is doing all that they can to hold these teams together. And let's make no mistake about it, the defense didn't give up the block punt.
Right.
For the safety. The defense didn't give up being put in a bad field position due to turnovers. So the defense is doing their part. And this is where John Harbaugh's strength has to be in keeping the defense from pointing fingers at the offense. And the offense has got to execute. To me, it's really the offense, the coaching staff, and John Harbaugh's got to own this too. I mean, I love John, but now the vocal minority that been wanting him gone for years, their voices are becoming louder and louder by the loss.
I can't disagree with you, Dennis. I mean, and like I said, late in the game, there were breakdowns across the board, including defensively. So that I have my concerns about just how they're handling that in-game adversity. But by and large, if you're looking at the whole pie, right, as far as what you're concerned about with this team, yeah, it's the inconsistency of the offense. And let's be clear, I mean, the pass catchers drops hadn't been a major issue in previous weeks, but something pops up every week, right? I mean, whether it's, a game where Lamar doesn't play as well, or the offensive line has too many breakdowns, or they're not running the ball quite as well at certain parts of the game. On this past Sunday, it was obviously the pass catchers dropping passes like crazy. So, at times I found Todd Monken's play calling to be a little questionable for stretches. The point is, it's not one specific thing that's plaguing them.
Not.
It's kind of across the board. And it hasn't been all bad either. Let's be clear about that. At times the offense has looked quite good and quite promising, and you see the potential, but they just keep, popping leaks, like something, they get something fixed and then something else goes wrong.
How about Ronnie Stanley, right? Okay. He was a turnstile from what I saw of him. He couldn't, Alex Highsmith went right around him and strip sacked Lamar Jackson. That wasn't Lamar Jackson. That was on your left, on your all-star, highly paid left tackles. They're making mistakes across the board, and they got to clean it up. I mean, and then you got Rex Ryan making fun of them on national television that they're practicing catching a rugby ball because it's bigger. And I mean, come on, man, this thing just. But all those drops were unbelievable. The Bateman drop in the end zone. I still can't wrap my mind around that one. All these things are leaving points on the field. And Lamar Jackson, and you nailed it. And I love Lamar Jackson as well as he played. I don't know what kind of a throw that was to Beckham Jr. It wasn't a back throw. It wasn't a shoulder fade. And you got a rookie cornerback who had to prove himself, pick off the ball very easily from your all-star, highly paid quarterback.
Yeah. I mean, it's just, you can't have that. And again, this isn't about, I think a lot of fans get caught up in the blame game, right? And it's like, oh, well, if we're keeping tallies of who messed up the most, and then the guy that messed up the least, we can't blame him. We can't hold him accountable. No, Lamar Jackson needs to be held accountable for that late throw. Again, should they have been in that spot? No, of course not. If they catch passes, then Lamar might not even be in the game at the very end. Marlon Humphrey probably isn't in the game to give up that home run, or the home run was a home run kind of, but that long touchdown to Pickens. But you have to handle the sequence of events. Everyone does. Coaching, your franchise quarterback, your stout defense, and your offense that was the reason why you were in that position. It could have been very simple. Whether it was Bateman, whether it was Zay Flowers, whether it was Mark Andrews. Someone make a play. Someone make a
Luke,
play at the end of the game to finish the football game. And no one across the board, no one made a play to finish that football game. And they lost a game they absolutely had no business losing as a result. So that's why, for me, yeah, the pass catchers were the big thing that stood out. I mean, how could they not? I mean, and by the way, I'm officially concerned about Rashad Bateman at this point. I don't know where,
yeah, there's
you know,
something wrong.
the physical part is one thing, but I start to wonder now if just, if you see a guy, I saw a guy who's not playing with any confidence whatsoever. And I don't know, maybe the hamstring was still bothering him. The foot, we know Liz Frank
What,
injuries are tough.
what about
But
the hands?
yeah, right.
It's the hands. It's not his hamstring. It's not his foot. The ball hit him
Well,
perfectly. But Luke,
that's when I think it's the headspace. Yeah.
right, and I flashed back to the latter Joe Flacco years when he didn't have a lot of weapons around him, to the point when the defense got a turnover, you were praying that they would score. When
Yeah.
Kevon Seymour got that fumble on that punt return, and I was saying, please score. When he was knocked out at the 7-yard line, I said this isn't good, because I didn't have a lot of confidence in the offense scoring it. And I don't know if that was the 4th and 2 or the interception in the end zone. I don't remember the sequence, but I know we came away after having first to go on the 7 with 0 points. That much I do know.
Yeah. Nothing. And again, someone make a play. Someone make a play. Or Todd Monken dial up a great call. Whatever it is.
Have Lamar Jackson run it 3 times. I don't care. We're trying to win the ball game here, right? Same thing I said at the end of the Colts game. Have on 3rd and 3, have Lamar Jackson run it twice. Have your Listen, you ran him 12 times before that. You're not going to run him in that sequence, and you're worried about him getting hurt? No, sir. Your best players have to show up. Mike Tomlin didn't throw a slant to Olszewski on that play. He dialed up. He saw cover
jugular.
0. He said, we're going to have our best player touch the ball. Bill Belichick in that situation does not call a cover 0. Bill Belichick will double cover Pickens, because Pickens is not going to be the guy. Let it be Najee Harris against Roquan Smith like the year before. That's okay. I'm okay with that, right? I'm okay with a linebacker and a running back. I'm not okay singling up the best wide receiver on the damn field one-on-one with your cornerback, who's just coming off of injury, by the way.
I was just going to say, if you're talking about Marlon Humphrey mid-season form,
come on, man.
I can probably live with that.
Put Brandon Stevens out. If you're going to single him up, put Brandon Stevens out there. Do not put Marlon Humphrey just coming off of injury against a guy he can't even cover when he's healthy. Never mind when he's injured.
Yeah, I don't know if I go as far as putting Brandon Stevens on an island either.
I'm saying, give me the healthy guy.
I hear you. Believe me.
Put Brandon Stevens on him with Kyle Hamilton or Marcus Williams over the top. But my point is, take away their best player in that moment, in that situation. And I do question their intellect. And I like Mike McDonald, but I mean, where is your mind at in that situation? And I know that what they like to do in that situation, but do that, rush 5 instead of 6, and double up Pickens. Who's the second best wide receiver? He's hurt. Deontay Thompson, Calvin Austin. I don't even know who they have on that roster. Pat Freiermuth was out. You don't have your starting tight end, and you don't have your second best receiver. So double the best guy on the field and take your chances that way.
No question about it. And again, this comes back to what I just said about this current Ravens team: coaching, offense, defense, special teams.
I love it.
They've had too many breakdowns late in games across the board. And again, look, I think Mike McDonald is a great defensive coordinator. I think you and I have talked about this before. He's probably gonna be a head coach, whether it's hanging on long enough to succeed John Harbaugh in Baltimore, or whether he becomes the head coach of, take your pick, the Minnesota Vikings in 2 years or something like that. But if there's one area you can point to where it hasn't looked as good, it has been late in games. Now, I'll also say this much. We know it's the NFL in 2023. Offense has the general advantage. They do. However, this defense, as well as it's played overall, again, we saw a breakdown at the worst possible time. And that's not to that doesn't mean it's all their fault. In the same way that if you blame Lamar Jackson for the interception, that doesn't mean you thought he stunk the first 50 minutes of the game. We have to have more nuance with this. On social media, we're all about, oh, well, it was this guy's fault or these guys' fault. So I'm not going to blame this guy or that side of the ball. No, that in the final 5 or 10 minutes, that was a collective breakdown,
Look,
across the board, everything.
well, football is the ultimate team sport. I mean, all team
Yeah.
sports are fantastic, but it never comes down to one play. It never comes down to the referee's call. It's collective. When they win, guess what? They win as a team. Head coaches, the coaching staff, the players, everybody. Same thing when they lose. You blame it on special teams, wide receivers, quarterback play calling, clock management, schemes. You name it. It was a total team lost, just like for the Steelers on the flip side. And I'm going to give them credit. They took their strengths and maximized them. Right? They got two great edge rushers. They got after the quarterback. They came up with a
Mhm.
with a timely block, and they found a way to win. So love them or hate them, whatever you think of them, it was from the head coach on down. It was a total team victory. As they were celebrating, we were miserable on our side of town.
No doubt. And I mean, look, I even said it. I don't think the Pittsburgh Steelers are very good right now. However, you leave a team in a football game long enough, unless they are really the worst of the
Okay.
worst, they're eventually, now, they didn't even do it right away. It took them a long time. They eventually took advantage of it.
They did.
And I mean, again, I look at that game and look, it's really easy. And you saw a lot of national talking heads. Oh, it's Ravens Steelers. This did not have that feel to me. This felt
No,
more
no.
like, I mean, the Ravens looked like they should have blown them out by 3 touchdowns. And they left them in the game. They left them in the game. Too many mistakes, too many drops, fourth
Uh,
down at the end of the first half, all of that. And then eventually, then Pittsburgh did come to life. And again, this is where I talk about the Ravens' utter inability to regroup and get off the mat when Pittsburgh finally did punch them in the mouth. And, at that point, it was all over and they had lost and they were 3-2 instead of being 4-1, just like a few weeks ago when they should have been 3-0 and they were 2-1. So, hey, woulda, coulda, shoulda. They're 3-2 and not 5-0.
well, to your point about offense and how the rules favor the offense, et cetera, in 2023 in the National Football League, my controller, she's been here 40 years. She's a Steelers fan, and she always has told me for many years when it comes to the Ravens and the Steelers, and I think it's just true throughout the entire NFL. She says whatever team's winning in the one-score game, whatever team is winning with 2 minutes left ends up losing. So I flash back to the Ravens game. In fact, when we hit the 2 minute mark, I thought of her and I said, Dag nabbit, she's going to be right because we're going to find a way. We have the lead with 2 minutes left, but now they have the ball and we're going to lose the game. And that's exactly what happened.
Yeah, I mean, it's just you've got to find a way to finish football games, and this team just has not been as good as it needs to be these last couple seasons to do that. If you want to make a deep January run and you want to be the number 1 seed or say the number 2 seed where you're going to be playing in the divisional round at home as well. So, I mean, this matters. This is the difference between going
Sure.
13-4 and 11-5 or 12-5 and 10-7. I mean, this adds up. And again, I'm not saying those 7 or 8 games that I mentioned these last couple of years that it's inexcusable for it to ever happen. Things are going to happen. You're going to have that happen once in a while, but that's too many for a little over or what, less than 2 years. That's a little over a season that has happened. Going back to week 2 of last year. Like I said, Miami, Buffalo, the Giants, Jacksonville, Pittsburgh in week 17 last year, Indy, and then Pittsburgh this past Sunday. That's too many when you're talking about a sample size there of what? That would be 20, 21 games of regular season football over that stretch. I mean, boy, that's really cutting yourself off at the knees in terms of putting yourself in position to potentially be a number 1 seed or a number 2 seed come playoff time.
No question about it. Luke, as always, I appreciate you. We went a little bit over time. We had to have some Orioles and Ravens therapy here. So I appreciate that. Please tell our listeners where they can find you, WNST, Baltimore Positive, your social media presence, your blog, and everything else that you do.
full disclaimer, but after everything I just said, just win on Sunday in London.
Just win,
We
baby.
didn't spend a
Yeah.
moment talking about the Tennessee Titans. You
Now
win.
it's a week-to-week league. We get that.
It
So
is.
you're right.
It is. It is. But a lot of what we just talked about, what's so troubling is this keeps happening. But check out my blog at baltimorepositive.com, sponsored by Coons Ford of Baltimore. I have residue on the Orioles. I will have some Ravens content. I've been light on the Ravens side because of, for obvious reasons, with the Orioles being involved in the postseason and being more immersed in that. But Ravens in London, of course, you can follow along on Twitter at WNST. Me personally at Baltimore Luke. I am not in London, but of course I'll be back on the scene in Owings Mills next week, as the Ravens will hope to improve to 4-2 and then turn their attention towards the Detroit Lions, which should be an interesting matchup. A Detroit team playing really well, but you want to be on the WNST Baltimore Positive Text Service, sponsored by Coons Ford of Baltimore. If you are, you'll get the latest significant roster news or latest significant local sports news, game day inactives, final injury report information, all of that sent directly to your mobile device via the WNST Baltimore Positive Text Service, sponsored by Coons Ford of Baltimore. And of course, anything throughout the week on AM 1570 with Nestor. Any of that Orioles post-game sound that maybe you couldn't come to listen to on Tuesday night or Wednesday, but it's there. We'll have plenty of Ravens sound as they get back from London and get back into more of a normal regular season mode. Check out all of that at baltimorepositive.com.
All right, my friend. I appreciate you, and I'm out next week, so I'm sure we have a lot to talk about, a lot to catch up 2 weeks from now. You stay well.
Be well, Dennis. Have fun, and we will reconvene in a couple weeks, and hopefully we're talking about a couple more Ravens wins and not having to talk about, well, whatever the heck that was that happened in Pittsburgh this past Sunday.
I sure hope so. So there he goes, Luke Jones here on 1570 AM, Baltimore Positive WNST. We'll take a quick break and come back right after this. All right, Luke, I'm spinning. I don't know if you can hear me, but I'm spinning around here. I had this happen to me yesterday, but the whole thing got recorded, so it's on my end. So I'll have Nestor just clip this at the very end here. So
yeah, well, I'm guessing Nestor will probably break it up into Orioles and then Ravens anyway. I know he does that sometimes, which is good. Hey, it's good content, and I know he likes to run it again, on Friday and Saturday, so that works out.
That's a good idea. Good idea.
Yeah,
well, I appreciate you, my friend.
All right, Dennis. Hey, have a safe trip. Well. You're going to Germany, right?
Going to Germany. Yep.
That's awesome, man. Have a great time. That's
Thanks so
cool.
I appreciate you.
I appreciate you too. See ya.
My friend. Bye-bye now. Be well.